You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
You're listening to an In Touch podcast from the UCL Knowledge Lab. I'm Lily Gul Mohammadi, and in this episode I speak to fellow In Touch doctoral researcher Douglas Atkinson about the role of touch in the garment design development process. Hello Douglas, thank you for joining me today to talk about your work. Like me, you're a doctoral researcher attached to the In Touch project at UCL, and your work explores the role of touch in the garment design development process at a time when it's becoming increasingly digitised. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about your background and what brought you to focus on this topic?
Okay, so I've worked in fashion education for a few years now, and really, it feels like a quite interesting time to be exploring touch in relation to how we design and in relation to how even the things that we put into garments are changing. So, for example, there are lots of new 3D design softwares that you can kind of virtually prototype a garment with, and you can take the entire process out of the physical realm and just kind of go through all of the iterations that a designer would normally do. For example, a toile, which is a prototype, so that would normally be like a calico mock-up of a garment. It's now possible to do that with 3D software. And lots of the kind of draping and the small manipulations that you might do with a physical material, you can now do digitally and experiment with them that way. So that's one example of how things are changing. But there are also developments like wearable electronics, which, although usually you would kind of integrate them into a fairly conventional garment, they change the things you have to think about during the design process. So they change the way that you have to consider, like, for example, how you might put a garment together and where the technology can be integrated and various things like that. And so also other things that are quite interesting, like 3D technologies and the ways we kind of capture the body using motion capture. That relies on certain points on the body being captured that mean that you would have to design a garment in a certain way to be able to kind of capture the nodes on the body that kind of highlight cardinal points which capture movement. So there's all these kind of technologies that have little influences on how we design garments. But they're also taking up a huge amount of time in a fashion curriculum now because they're very interesting, students want to engage with them. And so we've moved from a process that was very much almost like an internship or an apprenticeship, where traditionally, if you think of like a Savile Row apprenticeship, you spend a long, long time watching a master craftsman and learning how they would put together a suit, kind of observing all of their touch practices or their touch methods and the kind of skills that they have in hand working. And so it's a very kind of one-to-one, very close relationship that's centered around engaging with a material. Mm-hmm. And the problem now is when we're trying to teach students, because they want to have all these digital skills and learn all these new exciting things, is that it's very difficult to actually give them that kind of same apprentice level of experience working with physical materials. Mm-hmm. And so coupled with that, there's also the fact that a lot of these new digital developments have happened very recently. So although we're kind of used to the idea that, the idea of the split between Gen X and millennials was the split between the digital natives and people who'd grown up without connected internet technologies. In a fashion context, the people who've actually been using them in a design process, who've been completely digital in their design process, have come much later. So it's only really in the last 5 to 10 years that you've seen some of these technologies influence the design process. Mm-hmm. So it's an industry or a world that's been very late to actually adopt digital processes and techniques. And now we're really starting to see the impact of that. But one thing we don't understand properly, because it's very difficult to research touch, is the role that having a tactile, touch-based engagement with materials plays in understanding how to become a designer of garments and, in understanding what a garment can do if it's going to perform the functions you want it to. And so that's kind of why I came to this project, really, because part of me thought, oh, wow, I would love to kind of create a tactile interface for one of these 3D design softwares. Maybe a little bit ambitious, but that was kind of my first thought. And then actually in looking into that, I discovered that there's just very little research at all about that idea of what touch does in the garment design development process. There's lots of people who will tell you it's very, very important because materiality is obviously important in that process, but they've never really said why or how.
Okay.
So really, it's just that idea of the fact that no one said what's going on through touch in that context, and we're in danger of possibly losing it. We're now training people to work digitally more and more. So the attention has shifted from supporting like those practices of touch
to supporting the kind of digital training.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
And we don't know what we're losing in that process
Okay.
because, as I said, there's not much research into the role of touch.
Yeah. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense, and it's very interesting for someone like me as well, who's actually got a background in fashion. So to study these touch practices, you decided to spend time with a selection of fashion students and course leaders who also have their own practices. And within that group that you worked with, you had people working in an amazingly diverse range of specialisms and technologies. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. So part of the reason I wanted to work with both kind of professionals, if you like, and tutors, as well as kind of students in the fashion context, was to try and see if I could understand a bit about how ideas of touch and its role were passed on, and if there was anything I could tell through different educational levels. So I worked with 2 bachelor students, 2 master's students, and then 2 kind of tutor practitioners. And they did have some really amazing practices, actually. So at each level, I had someone who was focusing more on a digital practice and more on a very traditional making practice. So I had someone who made garments for tango dancers, and her practice was actually making really kind of well-engineered garments that moved with the body and kind of anticipated all the ways that someone might move or might be held or might want to kick, and just the way the garment needs to respond to a body in a tango dance context. So she was a very kind of traditional maker, if you like, but had a real understanding of the body and the mechanics of fabric and how they would move with the moving body like that. Then I worked with someone who was producing costumes for a virtual reality performance, which was going to be motion captured. She was producing costumes both in the virtual world and physical garments that would be worn by dancers who were then going to be motion captured. So I mentioned the idea of designing around motion capture nodes before, because there are those certain points on the body where you need a kind of, it's a reflective ball that's a reference point for the motion capture system to understand how the skeleton's moving. And so they need to be kind of visible through these garments, but the garments are also quite big showpieces and then are reflected back in a virtual avatar kind of character. So that was a really interesting one because it sort of bridged the 2 worlds.
Yeah. It sounds like quite a lot of fun.
It has been, actually, definitely. And then, so I worked with a few other people who were looking at just trying to understand how they would use a 3D design software, like I mentioned, to start to create garments that investigated the relationship between people's online or their gaming identities and their real life identity. So she was looking at the sort of like digital double lives we have and trying to create garments for those. And some of those were completely digital and some were, again, physical garments. Some of the students had some really, really interesting ideas as well. So there was one of the bachelor students who was looking at how she could create a speculative collection for the first Mars colonists and how she could use wearable technology to support them. So she was really interested in creating kind of prototype circuits that would help keep them warm or kind of give them alerts if they were being exposed to too much radiation. And she'd built this quite amazing context around the life of the person she imagined to be wearing these pieces. And then other students who are very much based around the material experience. One in particular who was really interested in trying to use found materials and to capture some of the properties they have. In particular, there was one instance when I met with this particular student when she'd just got some construction netting from the side of the building of her studio and was about to make it into something. And a lot of her work was about responding to material properties and how she formed them into a garment. Quite a diverse range and just really interesting to see. And I think one thing that struck me actually was that although I was looking at these ideas of communicating how to feel or what kind of desirable touch qualities are, it wasn't necessarily always something that went with experience. A lot of it went to do with just how engaged with materials and what kind of history of material play some of the participants had. So that was quite an interesting thing to think about, the resources that they bring to understanding how they touch, especially in that idea of education when you're saying, how can you maybe teach people a kind of refined sense of touch or teach people what they're feeling for.
Yeah, because studying touch practices in any context is extremely tricky, and that's been one of the challenges across the In Touch project as a whole. And the other thing I was thinking of is that I know from my own background of working in fashion that everyone has very, very different processes in the garment development process. There's no such thing as a kind of one true process, although sometimes it's taught like that. That's actually not the case. So you kind of went through this very layered approach, didn't you, when you were trying to study and unpack these practices? So could you say something about your journey there?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, though, that you picked up on the diversity of people's approaches, because that's one thing that came out time and time again, is that no one I worked with felt they even had a representative or a traditional or proper approach. And some of the ways that they used touch were actually ways of kind of almost corner cutting, or ways of making their process more streamlined as opposed to what they were taught to do.
So what's a corner cutting example?
Things like, for example, maybe rather than kind of making a calico toile, so a calico prototype, just kind of folding paper very quickly and putting it onto the body to see how it works. Something like that. So initially I tried to combine quite a few different approaches to an ethnographic observation. So within ethnography, the idea is to really situate yourself with someone and to be a part of their environment and their day-to-day activities. And so that's why I was working with a relatively small number of people, because I wanted to really understand in quite a lot of depth what they were doing and how they went about the process of designing and developing a garment. But there are a few different approaches beyond just a standard kind of ethnography, and one of which that quite a few people work with is called sensory ethnography. And so that prioritizes a lot more of the kind of activity of doing things with your participants. So co-feeling, so whenever any of the designers I was working with had a fabric sample or an interesting material, I would always try and feel it with them. And there were some quite interesting examples actually of rather than ever trying to describe a material, they would often kind of show me how they thought I should handle it. And so it wasn't a case of saying this should feel rough or this should feel stretched or something like that. It was a case of showing me how they would manipulate it and asking me to feel it for myself. And so I think that's one of the interesting ways that actually in this context, some of the difficulty of communicating touch has been gotten around in that almost that process of communicating from one designer or from a more experienced designer to a learner. So that was quite an important one. And another thing that sensory ethnography prioritizes is the idea that all of your senses are connected. You don't have a disconnected idea of touch. And I think that in haptic technologies, that's often a problem because they're focused so much on the hand and on trying to recreate just a kind of a skin surface touch that you lose the fact that your whole body is engaged in feeling things at the same time. So for me, I'm quite keen that in all of the analysis I'm doing, I'm focusing on touch as just felt experience more generally, and particularly like a kinesthesic experience. So an understanding of how the body is moving, or like the movements of parts of the body in relationship to one another. Because I found quite often that there were certain activities, like the way people would try to manipulate a material, or even just with the paper folding example, there are all ways to understand how to form it and to kind of build up a muscle memory or a felt sensation of the process they were going through. And there was one quite interesting example of one of the designers who was telling me that she actually thought she could remember how it felt, or knew what it felt like to draw the perfect shaped armhole curve on a garment pattern. She felt like she'd done that so often that she had the muscle memory. And so this kind of very particular curve that then is translated around the body was something she actually had the kind of memory of the felt sensation of drawing. So I found that particularly interesting because it's linking a kinesthesic sensation to an understanding of how a particular shape is going to mould to the body, and also an understanding of how a material will change when it's kind of cut into that shape and how it will be formed. So there's quite a few layers there, quite literally. And I think something that I'm coming across a lot is that key to all of these kind of fashion design development activities is this idea of moving between materials.
Right.
So moving from a paper pattern to a particular kind of fabric. And if it's calico, which you would use for a toile or a prototype, then understanding the difference between that and maybe a more expensive fabric that you would never use to prototype but is going to become your final garment. And so at each stage, it might not be a directed touch activity, but a kind of touch-based understanding of the different material properties of each of those materials comes in and informs these translation moments that you go through during the life of developing a garment.
And I know from talking to you previously that you kind of had I don't know if it was a light bulb moment, but what you planned to do kind of changed, didn't it? Because you realised that being with and this kind of feeling with wasn't quite enough to fully understand these touch practices. You realised you needed to actually have a go at these programmes yourself, didn't you?
That's right. So I ended up thinking about how I could combine an autoethnography approach as well, so just my own personal reflection, but being quite directed about recreating things that maybe I'd seen some of the designers I worked with doing, or trying to answer some questions around what I'd seen through recreating it myself and going through the process of either say kind of producing something at half scale. That was quite an interesting one, because there was a discussion that came up during one of my observations where the person who was making this half scale toile was thinking about the way the material behaved and whether it would behave the same way at half scale. And so that's one I had to try myself to answer it, because I was thinking, well, of course it must do.
And what was the answer? What did you find?
It doesn't behave as differently as I thought. I think it depends what you're making. If you've got something very large that's going to be very affected by gravity, then I think there's quite a good chance it will be different.
And then you were playing with a software. Was it a pattern cutting software?
Yeah, that's right. So Clo 3D, which is a software that's quite commonly in use now, was one that I experimented with as well, just trying to make my own digital garments and to see how it felt to not feel something.
And how did it feel? Sense. How did it feel to not feel something?
Well, I think the revelation for me was that I didn't really trust the process until I'd printed it out. So until I had a paper pattern, it didn't feel real.
Okay.
And then when I had a paper pattern, I think I had a more tangible reference point. And that's when I felt like, even though I'd been fitting something digitally on an avatar, being able to take a physical thing and relate it to a tailor's dummy was the point where I felt like I understood it.
Okay.
And so I think that's quite an interesting one in relation to this idea of moving between media or between materials in a design process, because traditionally there's so many stages where you move between materials that actually you only have that kind of one. Ideally, you maybe have more than that because you want to go back into the digital and redo it, but in theory you can only have that one point of transition where you're moving from the digital into a material rather than moving across several materials. And so I almost think that there's perhaps a lack of checks and balances through touch that you would get normally if you're working physically.
You said to me that your participants, because we've had quite a few conversations over the years about your work, and I think you said that some of your participants did that as well, that they, even after being in the digital, they still needed to check through physical touch.
Yeah, that's right. So one of my participants in particular, when she worked quite a lot with the same piece of software, and there were certain things that she would always say she would much rather do through physical manipulation because they just made more sense that way and they were in some ways they were quicker. So like working physically for her was the shortcut, because learning the nuances of, for example, how to create a flap on a pocket is surprisingly difficult in software, because it does this odd thing where rather than letting you just fold something back on itself, and you know if you're folding in real life you have the resistance of the material you're folding back onto, it asks you to specify numerically the angle of the fold. And it doesn't stop you from folding the fabric all the way back through itself if you change the angle too much. There are all sorts of things like that that are kind of specified differently and have a different reaction than they would in real life. And so for that particular designer, she was spending a lot of time trying to navigate that process of working back and forth and trying to see what she could understand from the digital and where it didn't meet her expectations. So she was a really interesting one to talk to because she was going through that.
But I think there was one more method that you used called thing ethnography. Could you tell us about thing ethnography?
Well, okay, so it's a method I tried to use and it didn't pan out quite how I wanted it to, but it did inform some of the work that I'm now doing to wrap up the project. So essentially thing ethnography is trying to document the experience of a non-human. So in this context, I was really interested in all of the tools and the objects that we use. So, it talked about how, there's actually a surprising amount of touch skill in pinning things or cutting things, folding things. So I was quite intrigued to know, like, if there was a perspective I could gain from using, like, a sensor-enabled object in a fashion workroom. And did some pilot studies with a different group of students just to see what they thought would be the most useful types of object to augment. And because, like we've mentioned the idea of this diversity of approaches a few times, because that came up quite a lot, really the thing that they thought would be most interesting would just be a touch sensing fabric or surface that would register things like location and pressure. And so something that could be applied, say, if you wanted to put it over the surface of a tailor's dummy, or if you wanted to kind of put it through a machine, or something that could have multiple lives, really, in a fashion studio. So I actually ended up developing some touch-sensitive fabrics. They're very basic, kind of low-tech Arduino-based prototype. Arduino is actually a very seemingly low-tech physical computing system, so it's something you can prototype interaction designs with, but they're kind of off-the-shelf computing components, basically. So essentially had 2 layers of fabric that had a conductive grid formed on them, so one layer with conductive stripes at 90 degrees to the top layer, and between the two there was a material which changes electrical conductance when you put more pressure on it.
Okay.
And so based on where you were connecting these 2 sets of conductive strips and how much pressure you were putting on it, the material would allow more or less electricity to kind of conduct through. And that gives you an idea of where you're touching it and how hard you're pressing it. Okay. So essentially what I wanted to do was to use these fabrics as just another part of the ethnography, put it into the fashion studios that I was working with people in, and see if I could use it to actually kind of get a more quantitative mapping of touch, and try and see how people might respond to that, or if it told me anything different from the observation and from the accounts I was getting from talking to people.
What did it tell you?
Well, so the issue became that one of the fundamental things that thing ethnography's inventors, designers, really hold as quite critical to it is that it gives you an idea of how people interact with objects over time. So you get the kind of temporality of what you're doing with a thing. And because quite often all the kind of objects that we use for certain purposes and certain kind of windows of time, and then kind of may have a very different life away from that. The idea is that you should be constantly recording data from these objects.
Okay.
And my problem was it was very difficult to try and constantly record data from one of my fabrics over like a really long duration of time. So in the end, it wasn't quite possible for it to be a thing ethnography in the truest sense. So what I decided to do was to use these as probes and to kind of use them as something to get the designers I'm working with to respond to, and to get them thinking about the possibilities of digital touch in a fashion studio or in the fashion industry as a whole. So because of COVID, this is the kind of method that didn't quite work out several times, but because of COVID, I couldn't actually use those as the closing piece of my observations with people in their studios, because obviously we weren't allowed to be together in studios. So that's now become a technology that I'm using as a kind of final workshop prompt, and I've yet to see whether it's going to be either in person or in very small groups or over Zoom, but to get people to think about what they might augment in a fashion or garment making process, what would be useful for them as practitioners, and to think about some of the ideas of how mapping touch, replaying touch, or kind of recreating a sensation might actually influence the industry as a whole. So what would be really useful for them as designers when they were working on a garment design, but also, what are their more dystopian ideas of how it might be used industrially, and to try and find out from that some of their kind of social understanding of, or their social construction of technologies, and particularly touch technologies in relation to garment making.
So this is kind of, as you were saying, this is the final part really of your research that you're just working through. You're looking across all the amazing experiences and data that you've got from being in all these different studio environments and spending all this time with people and by yourself working it through it, and now you're kind of addressing this question of whether digital touch technologies might be able to support these touch practices that you've been studying. Where are you at with that then?
So I think at the moment, rather than looking at whether there's a specific technology that can, say, recreate something in the way that I mentioned before of the idea of a lot of haptics trying to just recreate a surface texture, I'm quite interested in trying to see what roles some of the kind of touch activities that I've engaged with people with played in that learning process. So rather than just recreating something and saying, oh, okay, well, maybe ultra haptics would be amazing for recreating the sensation of draping a fabric, because ultra haptics, for those that don't know, is it's a mid-air haptic technology. So it's like ultrasound aimed at your fingertips, and it can give you a sense of resistance in thin air, essentially, which might be great for draping fabrics. But I think because at the moment there's a limitation in the fidelity of any of these technologies to truly recreate a surface texture or a very, very accurate impression of the physics of touching something, what I want to see is if there's ways technologies can support some of the things that happen when you're just working with a more experienced designer, or when you're playing with the material yourself. So, for example, one really nice instance that happened in my data collection was when one of the designers was trying to show me what she thought was the best, essentially the best material qualities in a silk crepe. And so I spent about half an hour bouncing different kinds of crepe. And again, it wasn't verbally described what a good crepe was. She just gave me various different samples and showed me how she would kind of flick them. And it essentially said, okay, so you're feeling for the response, and kind of gave me different ones to feel. And eventually, from having kind of felt the difference between a polyester crepe, a silk crepe, and different weights of them, I was actually able to understand what kind of kickback almost it should give me from when I'm kind of bouncing the silk. And so this was the woman who made tango dresses, and so for her that was a really important thing, because she wanted to understand how something might flick when, say, you kicked or when you moved in a dress.
Oh, wonderful.
And so I think tying it all back into in-touch and digital touch communication, it's how you communicate those sort of preferential qualities of a material, whether someone else is trying to kind of induct you into them, or whether you're maybe just kind of playing with a piece of building netting that you've taken down from the side of a construction site. How could it support that meaning-making process? But I think also because I'm interested in this perspective of what the things around us do in that process. So not always looking at it as necessarily having to be human-led.
Mm-hmm.
I think from what I've seen, there's a combination of both.
Mm-hmm.
So people who just really enjoy playing with materials and have developed that sensitivity, quite often, at least in one of the cases of my designers, that was developed through not really having much formal training. So this was one of the BA students who had a really, really strong affinity for materials. So I think it's not so much about necessarily human-human communication. And I think that opens up another can of worms depending on how you consider communicative activity, because I would like to think about this idea of how things communicate to us and what we learn through that engagement. So yeah, I don't know if that's got me any closer yet to which technology would solve the question. I think that's sort of the final wrap-up of the PhD, and to see what currently exists that might do that.
So you're in the final stages now,
yeah,
and lots of luck with it, and hopefully it's going to be an amazing PhD that we're all going to read.
Well, fingers crossed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Douglas. It's been really nice talking to you today, so thank you.
You too, thank you.
Thanks for downloading and listening to this In Touch podcast from the UCL Knowledge Lab.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.